When every prayer feels like a dry, rattling bone, when words fail and hope shrinks to a whisper, there are still two words that can change everything. Lord, help me. Picture a person at midnight, huddled under a kitchen light, a hospital corridor echoing with steps, or a quiet bed where the mind will not let you sleep. In that dark place, the polished sentences of religion fall away. What remains is one raw request, a tiny, fierce petition that carries the life of someone else on its back. That is the prayer we meet in Matthew 15:25, a prayer that came from the abyss and would not be turned away. If this message is speaking to the place in you that's worn thin, stay with me for a few minutes. If you want more clear, short explanations of classic sermons like this one, consider subscribing. It helps us bring these truths to life for you. We stand on the shore of a small but turbulent episode in the Gospels. Jesus moving near the region of Tyre and Sidon, a woman outside the circle of Israel approaching him, and a plea so simple it seems like a child's request. She asks for the healing of her daughter, who is possessed. The disciples, impatient and protective, urge Jesus to dismiss her. Jesus answers in a way that puzzles and even offends. He seems, for a time, silent. He tests. The woman does not retreat. Her persistence changes the scene. In Matthew 15:25, we read her terrible, concentrated cry, "Lord, help me." This message leans on the work of Charles H. Spurgeon. His sermon on this passage, sermon number 2597, preached August 23rd, supplies much of our pastoral frame. But we will not repeat his language exactly. We'll let his insight shape the way we look at the scene and at our own prayers. The Bible sequence is the backbone here. The approach, the silence, the opposition, the unyielding entreaty, and then the surprising commendation. Before we move deeper, mark this. The narrative happens in a borderland. Tyre and Sidon are Gentile cities, the margins of Jewish ministry. The woman is a Canaanite, an outsider in terms of religious identity and social standing. That fact matters. Jesus' ministry, at least in its early public phase, is portrayed as prioritized to Israel. Yet in this episode, something larger is being revealed about God's heart and about the shape of faith. So what makes the woman's prayer so powerful? Why has it been singled out by preachers across the centuries? Spurgeon called it transformative, not because of rhetorical skill or emotional theatrics, but because of its raw theological posture, a posture of utter dependence, tenacity, and identification with the one she loved. We can pull from this 4 essential moves that shape a prayer that pierces silence and breaks through barriers. In this first section, we will explore the first 2, importunity, relentless pleading, and the direct appeal to Christ. We'll begin to touch the others before we pause, so you can carry them into your own midnights. Importunity, the persistence that refuses to go away. The woman's persistence is not theatrical. It is not a demand issued in arrogance. It is the persistence of someone who knows the alternative is loss. Where much of polite religious speech frames prayer as a decorous ritual, the Canaanite woman's cry reads like an urgency in extremis. She has come to the one who, in her estimation, can set right a situation beyond human repair. Her words are short, but their energy is volcanic. Imagine a mother in a modern emergency room whose voice grows rough from asking the same question of the same indifferent nurse. Or a pastor who keeps returning to a council table because a congregant's life is unspooling and the policies of the institution seem to move at geological times. Importunity is the posture that continues when all recommended recitations, the correct forms, and the expected channels have failed. Spurgeon taught that God often calls us to a persistent faith that can take silence and even rebuff without capitulating. The point is not to manipulate God by repeated asking, as if force wears down divine will. Nor is perseverance an indifferent stoicism. Rather, it's a faith that has no retreat. The woman comes back to Jesus despite being outside the expected audience. When the disciples hint at weariness, when they try to have him send her away, she presses closer. Her persistence is the voice of one who has no other refuge. Here is where many modern prayers falter. We expect quick fixes or polite outcomes. We ask, we get a delay, and we conclude we have been refused. But the gospel shows us another pattern. Persistence does not always bend the will of God like a lever. It often refines the person who prays. In the woman's case, her persistence is a means by which her faith is made visible, not merely to herself, but to Jesus and to the onlookers. It dramatizes her dependence and her confidence that He alone can act. Ask yourself, when a door stays shut, do you leave convinced the door is locked forever? Or do you keep knocking, not out of ritual, but from the conviction that God's entrance may yet be granted? Importunity does not assume that God is a victim of pressure. It assumes God has reasons that sometimes include teaching us the depth of our need. A modern micro-story. Picture a young man named David whose wife fell ill, not in the dramatic sense of sudden catastrophe, but in a long, grinding decline. He had checked every doctor, followed all advice, and yet each solution was a temporary patch. At 3 in the morning, when hospitals are quiet and the word control feels foreign, David took a small kneeling stool to the parking lot and asked God plainly and repeatedly for help. He returned the next morning fatigued but strangely steadied, not because his circumstances had changed miraculously in the night, but because he had settled into a posture of dependence that reshaped his decisions and his capacity to care. Importunity pressed him not only to ask, but to act differently. A word of pastoral caution. Persistence in prayer should not be confused with spiritual stubbornness that ignores clear guidance or with simplistic bargaining. It is not a method to force God's hand. Rather, it is the humble, tenacious faith that trusts God's time and His ways, even while insisting on His power to act. Appeal to Christ alone, bypassing intermediaries and the tyranny of etiquette. The second move in the woman's prayer is striking. She goes to Jesus. She does not petition the disciples. She does not parade through the formal corridors of religious protocol. She appeals to the person who, in her judgment, holds the authority to heal. That directness is conspicuous given her status. There are social boundaries, cultural taboos, and a history of tension between Jews and Canaanites. Yet she crosses all of them. This teaches us a blunt truth. When we are desperate, going through the correct intermediaries is often a way to dilute the request. There are thousands of well-meaning people who stand between us and Christ. Counselors, pastors, committees, government agencies. These can be gifts from God, instruments of mercy, but they can also become obstacles when we substitute them for the authority who truly can act in a situation. Spurgeon emphasized that the woman recognized the person of Jesus as the decisive point of contact. Her faith aimed not at a network of helpers, but at the one who could and would act on a level beyond human capacity. She sought the source, not the circuit. We must be careful here. This is not an argument against seeking counsel or using earthly help. God often answers through other people. But the woman's example shows that prayer should aim fundamentally at Christ. When people or structures fail to produce the desired outcome, faith does not collapse into cynical self-reliance or bitter accusation. It goes once again to the root, the one who is able to do what no human institution can. Consider a contemporary example. A teacher named Maria is confronted with systemic problems at her school that harm her students. She has complained to administrators, filled paperwork, and suggested reforms. When progress stalls, she could either burn out or return to the spiritual source of her endurance. Maria chooses the latter. She prays directly to Christ, not instead of advocacy, but as the center from which her courage and wisdom flow. That direct appeal gives her a clarity and steadiness that renews her capacity to act. There is a theological tension here that Spurgeon handled carefully: the presence of human structures and the sovereignty of Christ. He did not suggest a person should reject earthly agencies. Rather, he urged the church to remember that Christ is the one to whom our cries ultimately belong. When the woman bypassed the acceptable channels, it was not an affront to order, but a brave, necessary move toward the only source of decisive mercy. Silence and testing, when Jesus seems to withhold a word. There is a moment in this scene that presses hardest on our hearts. At first, Jesus seems silent. He does not answer immediately. He allows the disciples' murmurs to hang in the air. Then he speaks in a way that confuses. He notes his mission to Israel. To her, this looks like a rebuff. To the crowd, it may have sounded like exclusion. To the woman, however, it becomes an occasion for a deeper faith. Why does God sometimes seem silent? Why does Jesus appear to test rather than to grant? Spurgeon argued that silence can be pedagogical, God's way of drawing the hidden convictions of the supplicant into light. When words fail, the soul reveals its true coordinates. Silence can expose whether we are bargaining, performing, or truly dependent. The disciples' reaction is instructive. They act like intermediaries of a system, irritated that someone unfamiliar to them persistently presses in. Their instinct is to shield Jesus from inconvenience. In modern terms, they resemble church leaders who protect programs and policies. Yet their protective instinct can become a hindrance when it substitutes for compassion. At this point, let me put a small question to you. What would you do if Jesus answered you with silence? Would you feel disowned, or would you lean closer? The woman leaned closer. She was not cowed into silence by divine delay or by human discouragement. Her soul seemed to say, "I have nowhere else to go. I will not be dismissed." This is a difficult doctrine for many. Some interpret silence as rejection. Others see it as a divine test meant to humble and to purify. We will come back to the theological contours of this pause later, but take note now. Silence is not automatically the absence of love. It can be an invitation to greater trust. Identification in intercession. Help me instead of help my daughter. One of the most arresting aspects of her plea is its grammar. She could have cried, "Lord, help my daughter." That would have been accurate, compassionate, and appropriate. Instead, she says, in effect, "Lord, help me." The difference is subtle but decisive. She takes into herself the need of the other. This identifies true intercession. To intercede does not merely list the ailments of others. It lets their condition become the intercessor's own. A parent who prays for a child in danger prays as if the child's life were their own. A pastor who stands in the gap for a congregation weeps as though the wounds were personal. The woman's phrasing collapses distance between persons. In doing so, it removes any passive or detached stance about the suffering of another. Why does this identification matter? Because it expresses the kind of love that drives action. When we internalize the other's pain, we no longer treat prayer as an abstract exercise. We feel the urgency, the shame, the dread, the hope. We are compelled to interpose ourselves before God. This kind of prayer produces a different tone, not a polite request, but an all-in appeal. Think of a hospital chaplain who refuses to say, "I hope he gets better," and instead prays as though the patient's breath depends on the chaplain's own. That prayer will change the faces in the room. It creates a solidarity with the suffering that echoes the cross itself, where God enters our suffering and makes it his own. A brief pastoral illustration. A teacher prays for a troubled student in the way the woman prayed, not as an assignment to fill in, but as a personal burden that shapes the teacher's choices, conversations, and interventions.
That teacher's prayer becomes a force that changes not only the classroom atmosphere, but often the teacher's own courage to step into difficult conversations. A question for the listener. Are your intercessions distant and catalog-like, or do they feel like they come from a friend who has taken another's pain into his own chest? Concision and total dependence, the compressed theology of two words. We approach now a point that deserves careful attention. The theological weight carried by the words, "Lord, help me." In one small sentence, the woman expresses surrender, need, and an invitation for God to do what only God can do. Help, in biblical terms, is not a casual handout. It implies action that transcends human capacity. Help here is not a partial nudge. It is a theological demand. Do everything that only you as God can do. Make up for our incapacity. Reverse the situation. Heal, deliver, restore. Those two words compress an entire gospel of reliance into a single breath. Spurgeon noticed this compression. He suggested that prayer's brevity is often its strength. Long strings of words can hide the true state of the heart. Concise prayer, offered from a place of inward desolation, is like a concentrated beam of light. It travels farther. But we must be careful with the language. This does not make prayer into a formula or a guarantee. The woman's help does not function as a magical word that forces outcomes. It is an honest admission of need offered to the right person. If someone asks, does praying like this mean the outcome is certain? The sober answer is no. Prayer is not a mechanical lever. Yet Scripture gives examples where such raw dependence receives a gracious response. In Matthew's narrative, after testing and exchange, Jesus commends her faith and the daughter is healed. That sequence must be preserved. Approach, silence/test, persistence, commendation, healing. Do not flatten the process into instant reward theology. That risk would violate both biblical nuance and pastoral integrity. At this stage, I want to pause and invite you to inhabit the scene for a moment.
Imagine standing just outside the crowd, hearing the woman's plea, feeling the tension of silence, watching the disciples' discomfort. Ask yourself, what is revealed about my own prayer life by this scene? Do I run to Jesus with directness, or do I settle for circular addresses? Do I persist when the answer is delayed? Do I let another's need become my own? These are not merely intellectual questions, they are diagnostic. Halfway through our exploration of these moves, a few small hooks to keep us attentive. What would Jesus' apparent rebuff actually reveal about God's mission? How does this episode affect our theology of who is included in God's mercy? What does it teach pastors who are tempted to prioritize order over compassion? Historical context and Spurgeon's pastoral frame. I promised a brief note on history. The sermon that shaped much of our perspective on this passage comes from Charles H. Spurgeon, famed for his pastoral passion and clarity. His talk on this text is numbered 2597 and was preached on August 23, 1883 at the Metropolitan Tabernacle. Spurgeon's pastoral instincts led him to highlight three features: the woman's unrelenting importunity, the dangerous comfort of relying on intermediaries rather than Christ, and the inwardness of true intercession. We should approach his insights with respect and discernment. Spurgeon wrote within a theological context that included robust views on election and divine sovereignty. He sometimes used rhetorical devices that sound assertive, even stark, to press his hearers. Our job is to listen to his pastoral heart without importing a deterministic fatalism. When he spoke of Jesus being sent to Israel, he used that concept as part of a larger pedagogical framework, not to say God is excluding people capriciously. Bearing that caution in mind, Spurgeon's emphasis on the quality of faith remains pastorally rich for us today. A brief pause here. We will later draw out Spurgeon's discussion about how the sending language functions as a test, not as a cosmic veto. For now, let the historical note stand as a reminder that our reflection is not a private invention, but rooted in a long line of pastoral meditation.
The disciples as a mirror when religious people get in the way. The disciples' response is an uncomfortable mirror for every community of faith. They view the woman as an intrusion. Their instinct is to preserve the rhythm of ministry, to avoid scandal, to keep matters orderly. It is easy to imagine their irritation as righteous zeal. After all, ministry can be messy. Leaders have limited time and resources. Protecting the mission seems prudent. Yet the gospel frequently rebukes that sort of righteousness when it replaces mercy. The disciples' attempt to send the woman away reveals a tendency to let policy trump compassion. They treat her need as an administrative problem. Their reaction demonstrates how easily those in ministry can forget the rawness of human suffering.
This should be a pastoral warning for leaders. When we police access to Jesus for the sake of propriety, we risk hampering grace. Jesus' later commendation of the woman and his willingness to be exercised by her persistence indicates that divine compassion will sometimes overturn our human categories. The woman's faith becomes a correcting lens for the disciples' limited perception. Keep this in view as we move forward. Leaders, protect your call not as a barrier, but as a way to increase access to compassion. Congregations, let your system serve humility, not arrogance. Where we are headed next. So far, we've laid out the scene, named the central moves of the woman's prayer, and wrestled briefly with the disciples' obstructive posture and Jesus' troubling silence. We have begun unpacking how importunity and direct appeal operate in real life. We have touched on identification in intercession and the compressed theology of concision in prayer. There are two more keys waiting to be examined in depth: the theological clarification about Jesus' mission language, the line about being sent to Israel, and the concrete, day-to-day applications that let this prayer form take flesh in our lives. How to pray in medical crises, how to pray through midnight anxiety, and how to pray as one starting new ministry responsibilities. There is also the pastoral imperative to balance confidence with humility, to avoid promising guarantees of physical healing while still urging boldness in approach. Before we move into those clarifications and into practical, concrete scripts you can use in your darkest hours, we must sit for a moment in the tension the narrative creates. Jesus' apparent restraint, the disciples' discomfort, and the woman's relentless cry converge to a dramatic apex. The crowd waits. The woman leans in. She does something startling. She reframes her request as if it were first and foremost her own. She collapses the distance between her and her daughter, offering a prayer that is both theological and gutsy. What we will explore next is precisely why Jesus' pedagogical pause matters and how to translate this posture into our modern contexts. We will examine theological safeguards so that we do not read this story as a guarantee that prayer is a transactional formula. We will also look at three specific situations: a medical emergency, a season of deep anxiety, and the opening days of a new ministry role, and provide short, usable prayers that echo the woman's simplicity while avoiding promises we cannot make. For now, remain with the image of the woman on the fringe, kneeling metaphorically at the feet of a teacher who, for reasons that will soon be revealed, is both testing and training her. Her cry, "Lord, help me," is simple, fierce, and wholly dependent. It is not finished work. It calls for a response that will teach us as much as it answers her. She had done something that many of us find impossible. She turned an apparent rebuff into a deeper pleading. Jesus' brief, puzzling words about being sent and his first silence are not the end of the story. They are the forge in which the woman's faith is tempered. When he finally speaks to her and calls her faith great, the scene is not a trophy given to an emotional show. It is the recognition of a soul that has passed a test of dependence.
To understand what is happening here, we must pause over that moment when Jesus seems to step back. In Matthew's account, there is an exchange that reads like a theological pressure test. Jesus indicates the focus of his earthly mission. The disciples are unsettled, and the woman is pushed to articulate a faith that will not be satisfied with custom or convenience. Charles Spurgeon hears this pause as pedagogical. He reads Jesus' manner neither as cruel nor as capricious, but as intentional. God will sometimes withhold an immediate yes in order to draw out a truer, stronger faith. There are several honest ways to interpret that being sent language, and we should not pretend there is only a single answer. One route reads Jesus' words as a reminder of the historical shape of his mission. The ministry of Jesus, until a certain point, appears to center on Israel, in fulfillment of God's promises through the ages. Another route sees the remark as a test, a way to reveal whether this outsider will accept religious categories or will push beyond them in sheer dependence. A third route notices how the gospel narrative ultimately subverts boundaries. The story of the Canaanite woman prepares the way for the Gentile mission without denying the integrity of Israel's role. All of these interpretive moves can coexist without forcing us into a rigid determinism. Spurgeon, preaching in Victorian England, used this text to press the listener's heart, not to assert a doctrinal wall around God's mercy, but to show that God's methods sometimes include a seeming refusal that exposes faith. We must be careful, however, not to turn his rhetoric into a dogmatic ladder. When Spurgeon speaks of sending or choosing, he does so in service of pastoral provocation. He wants the hearer to see that faith, when genuine, persists under silence and crosses boundaries. Our modern caution must be to affirm God's sovereignty without denying our responsibility to pray, to act, and to carry one another's burdens. So what does Jesus' commendation actually signify? It is not merely a reward for shrewd argument or emotional drama. It is the recognition of a faith that has moved beyond self-protective religion into total dependence. The woman meets silence with persistence, exclusion with courage, and concern for another with a willingness to have that concern become the center of her own prayer life. In that meeting, mercy is released.
This sequence, approach, silence, pressure, persistent appeal, commendation, and healing, is the biblical pattern we are called to attend to. Do not flatten it into instant mechanics. The story preserves ambiguity and depth so that our prayers do not become formulas. Yet the narrative also insists that God notices, Jesus responds, and faith is visibly honored. What then are the practical implications for the way we pray? How do we form a faith that looks like the Canaanite woman's rather than a checklist of spiritual habits? Here are 5 practical marks to shape a pray boldly posture in our lives, with concrete actions and short scripts you can use tonight. First, go directly to Christ. Make Jesus the primary addressee of your need. That does not mean you abandon wise counsel or community. It means you begin there. When the crisis comes, don't start with bureaucracy or intermediaries as if they were the source of power. Start at the root. Action steps. Pause before you vent to every available person. Take a breath and say, "Lord, I bring this to you." Keep a short, private line of address for God as your first move. Short script to use now. Jesus, I need you. I bring this first to you. Second, refuse to be deterred by silence. If the answer is not immediate, do not treat delay as denial. Silence can be a test, a school, or a revealing mirror that shows whether our faith is shallow or deep. Action steps. Set a time to keep returning to the same posture of prayer over days, not as ritual, but as repeated, renewed dependence. Combine this with a journal or voice memo where you record how you feel and what small steps God seems to be opening. Short script to repeat. Lord, I am here again. I will wait and trust. Third, internalize another person's need. Pray as if their need is yours. This is the heart of intercession. not a detached report, but a borne burden. Action steps. Picture the person vividly before God. Name specific ways their life is affected. Let your empathy shape your requests. If you are a leader, allow the congregation's pain to become a personal motive for action. Short script to use for someone else. Lord, this is name. Their need is mine. Make my heart into an intercessor's. Fourth, keep your prayer concise but full. A few honest words are often better than a long catalog of spiritual-sounding sentences. The practice of brevity forces theological clarity and emotional honesty. Action steps. Practice a one-line prayer you can return to. Let that line be your anchor. Use it in waiting rooms, before meetings, in the midnight stirrings. Short script to carry. Lord, help me. And then a one-sentence addition if needed. Help me to know what to do and to do it by your grace. Fifth, combine faith with wise action. The woman did not simply plead and then sit passively. Her prayer moved her to persist and to step back into the scene. Faith without action is incomplete. Action without prayer is brittle.
Action steps. Identify one concrete thing you can do this day that aligns with your petition. Call a doctor, make an appointment, speak to an employer, visit someone in hospital, enlist a friend for support. Let prayer shape the decision and the courage to act. Short script for action. Lord, help me to see the next step and give me the courage to take it. To make these marks more practical, let's enter 3 concrete, realistic scenarios and imagine how the woman's pattern can shape our words and choices. Scenario 1. Medical emergency. The long night beside an ICU bed. Imagine Anna. Her sister has been admitted overnight after complications. She is exhausted, the clinical lights are sharp, and medical terms spin like unfamiliar stars. Anna has already navigated phone calls, insurance details, and a waiting room of bewildered relatives. The hospital is full of small systems that must be respected. Yet Anna's heart is raw for one single thing: the life and well-being of her sister. What would praying like the Canaanite woman look like for Anna? First move, go straight to Christ. In a quiet corner she kneels or sits and says simply, Lord, help me. There is no polishing. It is the cry of someone who has run out of resources. Second move, persist in presence. If hours stretch into days with little visible change, Anna returns to that small line of prayer. She writes one line on a sticky note, Lord, help her. She keeps it beside the bed as a tangible anchor. Third move, identify with the one who suffers. Instead of a detached list, please be with my sister, Anna prays as if the sister's breath were tied to her own. Lord, let her breathe. Meet her in pain. Give me what I need to be present. Practical acts that go with the prayer. Anna speaks with doctors and asks the clear questions she needs to hear. She arranges for a friend to be with her sister so she can rest. She asks the hospital chaplain to visit. Prayer and practical decisions move together. Short script Anna can repeat. Lord, help her. Help me to be steady. Do what only you can do. Scenario 2. Midnight anxiety. When the mind will not let go. Consider Mark, who lies awake at 3 in the morning with a tight chest. He is not in physical danger, but fear gnaws. Bills, the future of his marriage, children he worries about. The litany of possibilities is cruelly creative. He has tried breathing exercises, music, scrolling the news. Still the mind will not rest. What would the Canaanite pattern look like for Mark? First move, confess the rawness. He whispers, Lord, help me. This is not a polished spiritual discipline, but the honest cry of one who cannot bear the weight alone. Second move, persist with a short prayer loop. Rather than trying to create elaborate theological speeches to quiet his heart, Mark returns to a 2-line anchor. Lord, help me. Keep me in your peace. He repeats it, not as mantra, but as remembrance.
Third move, bring biblical truth to bear. Mark recalls a verse that grounds him, perhaps Psalm 46:10, "Be still and know that I am God," or Romans 8:28, and pairs the short prayer with that truth. Practical acts that go with the prayer. Mark puts his phone down, texts a trusted friend that he's struggling, and sets an alarm to check in with himself in the morning and to take one small step toward a solution. Make one call, write a short note, sleep for a set amount of time. Short script Mark can use. Lord, help me. Soften this fear. Help me to rest. Scenario 3, new ministry responsibility. The first Sunday in a new role. Picture Leah, a young pastor who has just accepted leadership of a small, struggling congregation. The excitement is mixed with a raw sense of inadequacy. There are payroll questions, conflicting opinions in a council meeting, and the quiet ache of wanting to shepherd well. How does she pray boldly like the Canaanite woman? First move, direct appeal to Christ. She begins her mornings with a short confession. Lord, help me shepherd these people in your name. She keeps the prayer specific. Leadership, patience, wisdom. Second move, persist through discouragement. When a meeting is difficult, instead of retreating into defensiveness, she returns to that simple plea and lets it shape her next step. Third move, take the other's need into herself. She prays for members not as items on a pastoral checklist, but as people whose burdens she is willing to carry. Lord, make their wounds my wounds. Give me courage to enter their pain. Practical acts that go with prayer. Leah organizes a listening afternoon, sets up mentorship, and seeks counsel from a seasoned pastor. Her prayer compels her to action that aligns with mercy. Short script for Leah. Lord, help me. Give me grace to lead, wisdom to see, and courage to love. Across these scenarios, a pattern appears. Brief, direct prayer, persistence through silence, identification with the suffering person, action in the world that corresponds to trust. None of these guarantee a particular outcome, but all of them shape the soul and reorient the will toward God. A suggested mini prayer you can use whenever you have 2 seconds or 2 hours. Suggested prayer. Lord, help me. Do what I cannot. Give me wisdom, strength, and mercy for today. Amen. Label it as suggested prayer when you use it, but do not treat it as a magic formula. Let it be a gateway to honest conversation with God. Now we must return for a moment to a theological safeguard that the DNA of this passage insists upon. Do not convert persistence into coercion, nor silence into accusation. Prayer is not a mechanical lever you pull to produce an outcome. It is the posture of a creature who depends on God. Sometimes God answers with an immediate yes, sometimes with patient shaping over time, sometimes with a no that opens other doors.
Spurgeon's pastoral wisdom understood this paradox. Faith presses for God's mercy while accepting that the final wisdom belongs to God. A helpful image is this. Prayer is like bringing a case to the king. We bring our plea with boldness, but we recognize that the king is wise and sovereign. Our boldness is not a tool of manipulation. It is the honest audacity of a creature who trusts the king's goodness. Sometimes the king will answer in a way we do not expect, but his answer is not arbitrary. It is shaped by providence, grace, and a wisdom that sees more than we do. We should also say a word about the place of community and pastoral leadership. The disciples' desire to send the woman away was understandable in a human way. Leaders must often manage crowds and systems. Yet the gospel's critique is clear. System without compassion becomes a barrier to mercy. Leaders should therefore cultivate habits that enlarge access to God's compassion rather than narrow it. That means listening more than managing, presence more than policy, and a willingness to be surprised by faith outside familiar boundaries. How, practically, can a church or a small group cultivate a pray boldly culture modeled on this text? First, train people to take direct prayer seriously. Encourage members to start with Christ in urgent moments and to keep short, faithful prayers. Second, cultivate a pattern of persistent intercession. Have a daily or weekly rhythm where needs are repeatedly brought before God rather than handled as one-off items. Third, make hospitality a priority. Remove administrative barriers when someone in pain knocks. Create a simple, compassionate pathway for people to be heard and prayed for. Fourth, teach leaders to be corrected by unexpected faith. When someone outside the usual circles approaches with boldness, let that motion reshape how the congregation understands God's mission. Now, before we close, a brief note on the relationship between bold prayer and pastoral caution about promises. In our desire to encourage boldness, we must never promise outcomes as certainties. Spurgeon never offered prayer as a shortcut to guaranteed healing. Rather, he lifted up the reality that God often works in response to faith. The gospel preserves mystery. We can teach people to pray boldly, to persist, to act wisely, and to bear one another's burdens, without promising that any specific petition will be granted exactly as asked. If you are a pastor or leader using this material, emphasize both boldness and humility. Teach the congregation to ask for big things, but also to lament and to trust when outcomes differ from hope. Finally, let us return to the heart of the title that began this message: Pray boldly. The Canaanite woman's prayer is our exemplar because it is compact, courageous, and comprehensive.
It names dependence, Lord. It stakes claim to the power that only God has, help me. And it becomes the engine of action in the world, persistence, identification, and movement. As we close, I want to offer one last, short, direct prayer you can use now. Very simple, very honest. If you are in a place of need, say these words aloud, or in the quiet of your heart, as many times as you need. Suggested prayer for now. Lord, help me. I have nothing I can offer but this plea. Do what only you can do. Give mercy, wisdom, and strength. Amen. If you are watching and you want something to take with you, there is a small one-page guide linked in the description, a condensed version of the moves we have talked about, a short anchor prayer, 3 application scripts, and a reminder list of practical steps to match your petition. It's free, and it exists simply to help you rehearse these habits in the days ahead. This teaching draws on a long pastoral tradition, and I want to give credit where credit is due. Our reflections here are shaped in part by Charles H. Spurgeon's meditation on this scene, sermon number 2597, preached August 23, 1883, and of course by the biblical text itself, Matthew 15:21 through 28, in which verse 25 contains that piercing cry, "Lord, help me." Let those anchors remind you that you are joining a conversation across centuries. Your cry is not new, and God has heard such pleas before. One final encouragement: if your prayer feels feeble, or if you are discouraged by delay, remember that persistence is not a public performance. It is the quiet, stubborn movement of a heart that refuses to be satisfied with anything less than God. The woman's posture was not about winning an argument. It was about staking her life on the mercy of God. You can do the same. If this message has spoken to you, consider sharing it with someone who needs a short, fierce reminder of how to pray. Download the one-page guide in the description to have these scripts at hand. And if you want more clear, concise explorations of classic sermons and biblical scenes, subscribe. We'll bring another short, grounded study to you soon. May God give you courage to pray boldly,
wisdom to act rightly, and the peace that comes from knowing you have taken your need to the only one who can fully answer. Amen.